Good day, fellow Neverwinter players. If you find any of the information presented in this video useful, or if you have critiques, please hit me up on Twitch. That's www.twitch.tv/Lord_Willow_. This is probably going to be my most controversial video to date, and as always, I welcome a respectful debate. So please leave any questions or critiques in comments below or hit me up on my Twitch stream. In today's video, I plan to discuss a relatively hot topic, and that's class power rankings, class balance, and where it is at pre-class balancing, where I would like to see it go, as well as concerns that I have for where it may be going. It is my sincere hope that this video dates itself very quickly and that we have a whole new set of things to talk about in the next few weeks. Some of the numbers I will be using are approximates, and those numbers do not necessarily equate to viability for content in the game. But these numbers can create prejudice in the community when leaders are assembling groups. Okay. Before I talk about where DPS classes stand next to each other in a ranking fashion, I think it's important to understand some of the main reasons that group leaders try to assemble the best parties possible, as well as why speedruns are so popular. First off, time is money. The more content you can complete in a shorter time is more in-game currency in your pocket. This currency comes in the form of rough AD, drops you can sell in the auction house for 80 astral diamonds, as well as refining points or other items you can use to boost your own character. I would conjecture that this reason was the primary motivator behind closed doors to some of the scaling changes with Mod 16, which resulted in drastically lowering player horsepower in older content as well as lengthening playing times. Secondly, fast kills mean less exposure to dungeon mechanics, in some cases even skipping mechanics entirely. This puts much less stress on all party members, less chances of botching a mechanic, lesser need for heals, which means lesser need to manage divinity or soul sparks for healers, lesser need to mind aggro for tanks, and less damaging hits coming to DPS, which reduces the chance of DPS going down and getting stacks of revival sickness. Thirdly, most people do not enjoy sitting in the same dungeon for over an hour trying to complete the content. It's a situation that isn't enjoyable for anyone. Basically, the faster you can finish content, the easier it will be to finish, and the more currency you will earn in game. This means that the majority of people assembling groups will favor the quote best unquote party mix for fast content completion. For those newer to Neverwinter, this party configuration is referred to as the meta, and that meta is constantly changing. Think of it this way. Every single week, there are patches to the game that could fix or change any item, any class, or any feat/feature. This means this meta is in constant risk of change, and it does change frequently. As a disclaimer, there is of course a sizable number of players in-game that view the meta concept with contempt. These folks typically fall into the play how you want category and cringe every time they look at the class features or feats and see a bunch of non-viable choices. Or maybe they just want to play the class they like and still be included in groups. It's a game after all, and they want to have fun too. So let's talk class ranking. Some ground rules for today's class ranking. I'm only going to talk about single target DPS today, as the power rankings for AoE are different, and groups rarely build for AoE damage, as AoE is for the most part trivial in most dungeons. 2. The percent numbers are approximate and represent potential in skilled hands with the right build, with the right stats, and the best items. Changes to any of these variables can create outliers where a class may look better or worse than its actual potential. 3. We are only considering classes with DPS roles using their best DPS paragon for single target. I want to stress that class balancing is also very important for tank and healing classes, but it is also much harder to measure. So, the rankings. Rounding out the top, we have the Rogue, followed very closely by the Wizard, with the Ranger coming in about 15 to 20% less than those top two, with the remainder of the classes falling between 30 and 40% behind. So what's the deal with this disparity? To talk about disparity, we need to delve into the current state of class balance and where I think it should be going. First off, let's remove the bigger outlier class from the equation, which is the Warlock. The only explanation I have for the single target DPS in the Warlock is it's just plain out poorly executed to begin with. The Ranger is a little bit of an outlier as well, but it's less so. And part of that's because its best single target paragon, the Warden, is pretty obviously more geared towards AoE, which it absolutely excels at. I would say the Ranger is probably the best AoE damage class in the game right now. The Ranger's other paragon path, the Pathfinder, either really wasn't tested or it's poorly implemented. It doesn't work very well, and it's just not competitive in endgame content. So that kind of leaves us with two groups. We've got the Rogue and Wizard in one group, and we've got the Barbarian, Cleric, and Fighter in the other group, right? Thanks to a lot of work from the community and some feedback via the official game forums, we know that these two groups implement bonus damage mechanics differently. Put it very simply, this is how the damage formula currently looks for the Rogue, Wizard, Ranger, Warlock. Final damage equals damage times, and then in parentheses, combat advantage plus your crit strike, times your class buffs times all other buffs, right? This means that for these classes, their class-based buffs are currently multiplicative on top of each other. For the Barbarian, Cleric, Fighter, its final damage equals damage times, and then in parentheses, your CA plus your crit sev plus your class buffs, close your paren, times all other buffs. For these classes, the class-based buffs are additive to each other, which reduce their impact, as well as being glommed into the combat advantage crit portion of the formula, which is an even further reduction. In most cases, this literally results in the classes doing substantially less damage, and the numbers show in the dungeons. But have no worries, class balance changes are coming. On August 22nd of 2019, Neverwinter developer No Worries posted on the official game forum that the intended damage formula should look something like final damage equals damage times CA times crit sev times the combination of all your buffs, all your additive. No Worries also stated that the mechanics are working properly on the Barbarian / Cleric / Fighter. I'm really not sure how that can be when we as a community have demonstrated that the damage formula is indeed not working per his post on the 22nd of August. While the buffs are indeed additive, they are additive in the wrong part of the damage formula. While No Worries proposed formula will result in increased damage for players due to crit and combat advantage finally being separated after 6 years. But it's also creating a whole new problem for class balancing in regard to gear selection. So let's take a deeper look at that proposed damage formula. And before we start, I promise to keep the math light and hopefully pretty easy to follow. So we can take the damage formula, final damage equals damage times combat advantage times crit severity, or basically crit, times the combination of all your buffs. We can extract that down so that we basically blow up and put in parentheses our class-based buffs plus our gear buffs. And then to really simplify things, we will remove the crit and combat advantage formula. So basically what we wind up is a formula that looks like final damage equals damage times, and in parentheses, class base buff plus gear buff, and your parentheses. So for a class with higher base damage, no class-based damage buffs, it would just look like this formula here, right? And we can see that if you have a 50%, an item that gives you 50% buff to your damage, that it actually is increasing your damage by 50% in this case. We can then take something like, let's say, a lower base damage class. In this case, I'm going to use 800 as my base damage. And then I'm going to say I've got a class-based buff that's, plus 25%. And then another one that's, plus 50%. You can see by combining these in, my damage is lower, but my base damage started lower, but that gear buff is now only increasing my damage by 40% because there's diminishing returns there due to the additive nature of these buffs. As you can see, by placing all the buffs together like this, it will cause percent damage gain bonuses on gear not to be equally applicable to all classes or even class paragons. Let's see some real game examples. So let's say we got a ranger using Seeker's Vengeance and Flurry compared against a barbarian using Rage, and then say the Heels of Fury, which give a plus 3% melee damage bonus. Using just base weapon damage and simplifying using the same base damage as the base doesn't, so that, because it doesn't change the percentage impact, you can see that here, I've got the ranger. Final damage equals damage times, and then in parentheses, my Seeker's Vengeance buff plus my Fury buff plus my Heels of Fury. So if I'm starting out at 1,000 damage, my final damage is 2130. The Heels of Fury are actually increasing my damage in this calculation by 1.43%. Right? Let's look at the Barbarian. Again, same idea, except for now in parentheses, we're just adding Rage plus Heels of Fury. My total damage output is lower because I'm starting with the same base damage, and I have less buffs, but the Heels of Fury are actually increasing my damage by 2.61%. As you can see, the Barbarian in this scenario gets more benefit from the percent-based gear. Okay, so let's balance these classes without equipment. We're going to simplify this even more. We're going to take the Barbarian, and we're going to set his base damage to 1,000. We're going to use that as our point, and we're going to add on that Rage buff. So I'm enraged, or unstoppable in old Gwyff terms, right? My total damage output is, my final damage is now 1150. Doing some creative math behind the scenes, I'm setting the base ranger base damage at 547.6. That'll give me that 1150 number for the final damage, and then I've got my Seeker's Vengeance and Flurry buff there, right? Okay, so that's without taking equipment into consideration. I have now balanced these classes. As you can see, the final damage is even. Now let's add the Demon Lord set bonus, averaged out to 10%. So we're just going to add 10% more on there inside the damage formulas. Add that in. Oh, holy crap, what happened? The Barbarian is now doing more damage than the Ranger. As you can see, the Barbarian does do more damage in this scenario. In fact, it does just under 4% more damage than the Ranger just by adding that same gear to the class, right? This imbalance gets worse and worse the more damage buffs a class has. Like in the case of the Ranger, where you can combine Seeker's Vengeance and Flurry, the impact of that percent gained gear becomes less and less. So imagine the dev team perfectly balances the classes without taking gear into consideration. You add any percentage-based gear to that equation, and ta-da! Like magic, the classes are no longer balanced. Or imagine that the dev team perfectly balances the classes with the best in slot gear taken into consideration. As soon as you add a new piece of gear or change your gear, bam, classes are no longer balanced again. Now let's look 3 to 4 mods into the future. We're going to have numerous gear items added. Who knows what else changes are going to come with class balance, right? And now all of a sudden class balance starts to look like it's just as big of a pile of mess as it is right now. So what can we do to mitigate this problem? Really, I see two kind of main options. Option one, we remove all class-based damage buffs. This is pretty self-explanatory as it removes class buff impacts as variables into the equation, right? But that would constitute a major change to the game, require rebalancing power magnitudes on every class, or alternatively, anytime you see something where gives you 10% more damage when you're standing behind the target, instead of doing that, maybe it can add an extra magnitude hit. When you hit, you give you another hit for X magnitude, right? This will, of course, require extensive testing to ensure that each class is putting out the same damage per second, and that each class paragon has the flexibility they need to introduce variability, right? Option number two is modify the damage formula like this. Final damage equals damage times CA times crit sev times class-based buff times gear buff. Changing to this should take less effort to implement, keeps all the other buffs additive, but doesn't arbitrarily reduce the effectiveness of gear just because you run a different class. Plus, this should make testing a whole lot easier for the dev team as well as the community as a whole. Of course, the downside of this approach is that any class buff feats or class features that give damage buffs become virtually mandatory, locking you into very specific builds that you might not want to run. In closing, I do have an open message for the Neverwinter development team, if they're listening. We in the community do understand that you have all poured your blood, sweat, and tears into making Neverwinter game experience the best possible within the framework of your budget and resources. We also understand that you are stuck in a tough position between a fickle user community and corporate taskmasters. I sincerely thank you for your efforts. But we also know that you have a lot of free resources in the community that you could be leveraging to make your lives easier. I do recognize that you as a team have begun to use those resources to great effect, namely with the Tower of the Mad Mage trial. But there is a whole lot more you could be doing. A recent example of some of the balls that are being dropped is with the profession level changes and new recipes that should have been on test and had a solid couple of weeks of player feedback. Instead, we in the player community wound up with a frustrating mess. Another recent example is with the Last Tales of Old event. Not only was it broken on preview so we couldn't test it as a party, but the mechanics were not working as described. We even had logs that showed enemy hit points and damage increasing dramatically between phase 1 and 2. These and many other items could have been mitigated if only the user community was leveraged for testing and QA was followed up on. These kinds of issues degrade the faith your player community has in your ability to deliver meaningful and fun content, and ultimately directly impacts player numbers as well as your revenue stream. If you have any questions or more points you would like to discuss, feel free to catch me on Twitch. That's www.twitch.tv/Lord_Willow_. Thank you for your time and have a fantastic day.